Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience Podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions.
Where you can take that leadership that you've learned and you can apply it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you a quick example. In 1998, I believe it was, my team, ODA 726, pretty senior team. The guys on my team were very senior. I was the most junior guy on the team, and I was the detachment commander.
Yeah.
But my team sergeant had been in like 21 years, my warrant officer 19 years, my assistant team sergeant 17 years, all in 7th group, all in special forces since they called them SF babies.
Right.
But we there was a coup attempt in Paraguay.
Wow.
South America was our region of operation. Paraguay was our primary country. There was a coup attempt. And so General Oviedo had tried to overthrow the government. And so our team was in the hopper to go down there anyway. And they accelerated our deployment. We went down there and we were working with this newly minted special operations unit out of Paraguay that was very good. And the idea was to really illuminate their work and to do a full mission profile at the end of our training with them that would be highly visible, attended by ambassadors and heads of state, to send a message to Oviedo and others: don't even try it again. And so we did that. We got down there and we were like, it was a very high vis mission. And my job was, as the detachment commander, make sure the resources were there. Yeah. Well, I had failed to get the rehearsal area for the before doing the full mission profile. I'd failed to get a good rehearsal area. And there was some rivalry with this unit we were training. So I couldn't get the land. And we're in trouble, because if we can't rehearse with these choppers and medevac and all this other stuff, these guys are going to look like clowns. Yeah. And it could be a real mission failure. So I reluctantly let the leaders on my team know, the guys that technically worked for me, my team sergeant, my warrant officer, and I let them know that I dropped the ball. And my warrant officer had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. His name was Bob. He said, "Come with me, sir." And so he takes me over to the compound, the Paraguayan compound, to the range control, where this little overweight Paraguayan captain was in his office in a cinder block building, working, salsa music blaring. Right. And we go in there, and my Spanish was still pretty crappy. And so Bob walks in, they high five each other, they start rapping in Spanish, and I'm trying to keep up with it.
Right.
And I couldn't really keep up. And as we left, I said, "What happened?" And Bob said, "Good news and bad news. Good news is you got your range. Bad news is you have dinner plans tonight." So we went back, dropped the team off, and then went back on base. Bob went with me, and we drove to the other side, which was the officer housing, junior officer housing, literally cinder block, single-story buildings with curtains for doors, dirt floors, and kids and roosters running in and out of the front door. Yeah. So we get there, we walk inside, Mike, and the guy is so excited to see us. It's the same little captain. Uh-huh. He's in a 7th group t-shirt and flip-flops and shorts, and he takes us inside, gives us a beer, and he's showing us around his little house.
Yeah.
And he takes us around his living room. He's so proud. He's showing us every wall in his living room was decorated with one of those certificates of appreciation from 7th Special Forces Group, with a little black, cheap-ass black frame that you get at the 5 and dime.
Yeah.
His entire house was decorated with these certificates dating back to 1986.
How
from
cool.
Every team that had been there.
Yeah.
And I just looked at him. It was creepy, but I thought, wow.
Yeah.
Every team that has come down here since 1986 contributed to me getting that range.
Yeah.
It was the social capital that had built, and that also stayed with me. And a lot of our missions were like that. Yeah. It was building and maintaining these relationships like it was a precious Fabergé egg. Yeah. You went down there for half a year, you trained with them, you maintained that relationship, and you handed it to the next team. Yeah. And they kept it going, because you never knew when that balloon was going to pop. Yeah. And a handful of guys could say, "I know him, I can do this." And they would be deployed to go handle the situation, and you have a mall bell.
Yeah.
Right. So that was the other side of it that a lot of people don't know, I think, is that so much of the work is rapport building and social capital.
It's relationships.
It's relationship.
It's relationships. You talk
so is
about it in
life.
your new book. You
Yeah.
talk about the importance of relationships, the importance of connecting. You know, I mean, somebody opens up the first page of your book or second page or whatever it is, right? And there's a blurb plus from Mike Rowe,
Yeah.
right? That's a relationship thing because you're sitting with him and you're taping something, but you're
Yeah.
sitting with him and you're like, hey, I just need you to do this. I'm writing a book, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, I don't have time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But I just need you to talk about this. I just need you to, right? Like you're not taking no for an answer. There's no way. Right.
No.
But prior to that, you had built a relationship and a foundation with Mike to where Mike couldn't say no. There wasn't any way with a straight face that he was going to turn you down. Right. Blurb plus. Right. I love that. Okay. But that's your life, man. That's what you've done. And the thing about it is, we still haven't seen the whole legacy of what you've done. We still haven't seen all of it. We will in the coming years and decades, right? But the foundations that you've built and the relationships you've built all around the world for the United States Army and for the government, right, is something that people are literally trading on today. They're building on today. They're using it to go get that range. They're using it to go do the things that they, right? And the fact that he was bringing you to his castle, right? Yeah, it's rough. Yeah, it's, but it's his home, right? It's his castle. And he's showing you around, and that pride and that excitement, that all came from all of you taking such great care of him.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a real leadership lesson here, Scott, in you going to your chief warrant officer and saying, hey, I blew it.
Yeah.
Right. And he says, come with me. Unbelievable. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
100%.
as a leader, you earned that right. You had invested enough in him and enough in your people to where you earned the right for him to take you and help you do this.
Yeah. 100%.
Does that make sense?
It makes total sense.
Leaders in today's world mistakenly, I believe, think they have to have all the answers. Really, the answers are in the people you're in charge of.
100%.
They're all
That's so
there.
true.
All you have to do is stay in curiosity, take great care of them like you did, right? Like you said, you were the youngest person in the entire team and you were the officer in charge.
Yeah.
You with me?
No, 100%. And I think that a lot of people, you're right, especially in this zero defect world that we live in today, feel like I have to have all the answers. And the reality is it's the opposite.
Yeah.
I feel like the leaders that ask the best open-ended questions, that start with what and how, they're typically the ones that we want to follow. Just a couple of things I'll add to what you just said, though, is like, that's not unique to special forces either. And I think you made that point but the reality is three major takeaways I had from that moment that I teach to this day is one is the relationship is always the asset.
Yeah.
We live in a transactional world, Mike, where everything is about the, pulling of the lever. And then the relationship is used as a means to the transaction. But the reality is the way humans are wired, and the neuroscience of late points this out, that actually we are social creatures. So social capital, those tangible linkages between and intangible linkages between humans that allow us to actually do things, that's the highest form of capital in the world. And all other forms of capital flow from that. The other thing that I'll just say here, and I think it will come up time and time again, but it was my team sergeant and my warrant officer that taught me this, is when it comes to human capital, social capital, you build trust when risk is low and you leverage it when risk is high.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we've lost as a civil society is we've, in this modern churn that we live in, you think that you build trust whenever there's a crisis, and it doesn't work that way.
No.
The reason Pineapple Express worked was because of 20 years of relationships that had been built before the collapse.
Exactly. It was all trust that you built over all that time.
Absolutely. And that's true in banking. It's true in tech. It's true in small businesses and nonprofits. If your relationship portfolio is the most important book of business you have.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I couldn't agree with it more. So you're in Paraguay, right?
Yeah.
And you end up leaving there. Where do you go from there?
Well, so I was stationed at what used to be Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I think it's called Fort Liberty now.
Yeah.
And that I was in 7th Special Forces Group. And this was from like 95 until God, till the war started, we were deploying to Central and South America. So I was Paraguay, Panama, Colombia, Peru, just gone all the time. That was, and I was out, as an SF guy. And then I was at Fort Bragg when 9/11 hit. And, there's out of 1.4 million people, there's only 6,500 Green Berets. So fifth group got the nod first, but it was very clear to the rest of us that our time in the hopper was coming.
Yeah. Can you talk about that for a second? Because we're currently taping on September 13th, and we just recognized and just observed 23 years since 9/11. Can you talk a little bit about what 9/11 was like for you? I mean, I know what it was like for me, and I'm curious what it was like for you.
Yeah. I remember a couple of things come to mind. I was at Fort Bragg, and so, I was a company commander in Special Forces, and we were actually driving to Fort Pickett, Virginia with my first sergeant and my assistant, or my senior range guy, and we were in the car and driving towards Virginia, and we heard on talk radio that one of the towers had been hit. And my first sergeant had seen a lot of combat in El Salvador, Panama, and he immediately knew something they were saying even then that we're not sure if he turned around in the median of the interstate and started speeding back to Bragg. By the time we got back to Bragg, the second plane had hit, and we ran into the orderly room. And what I remember were these senior SF NCOs all staring at the television, watching the towers, and then we watched them fall one at a time. And I remember looking at the faces of those men, and I've never seen, I have seen looks like that before, but never collectively like that. The level of quiet, simmering fury that was on their faces, and no one spoke a word even after the towers fell. I just looked at First Sergeant. I said, "I'm going to go to the battalion and get an update." He's like, "Roger that, sir." And so everybody just knew that something was coming. That was number one. The next, so I went home that night, and Monty, it was all that was on the news. Our little boy Cody was 3, and he was playing in this living room in our little bitty house, and Fox News was on, and the towers were falling over and over again. And Monty and I just held each other, and we knew that like our lives had changed forever. The next day when I went to work, they didn't know what to do with the gates because, it was an open post at that time. So they had closed the gates. We didn't know what was coming our way. And I had to walk. I can remember soldiers, paratroopers, and Green Berets were parking their cars on the sides of the road leading into Fort Bragg as far as 5 miles away.
Yeah.
And so on the day after 9/11, the 82nd Airborne and Special Forces were walking onto base to get to work because you couldn't get on base.
Yeah. Nobody knew what was coming. Nobody
and
knew what was coming. It was like, it was crazy.
Yep. And then the final thing I remember is not long after that, my wife called to tell me that my Ranger buddy Cliff had been killed in the Pentagon. And he and I had been very dear friends. We had gotten each other through Ranger School. We had named our firstborn Cody. Like we were tight, and we had stayed in touch through the years. And I remember when I learned that he was killed, I was just furious. And all I could think about, honestly, was payback, was getting over there and killing as many of those Taliban and Al Qaeda folks as I could. And that became kind of, I think, emblematic of a lot of us. We just wanted payback. And so for the first several years of the war, although there were some groups that did very well with the by, with, and through thing, most of the special ops community was focused on surgical hunting.
Yeah.
That's what we did.
So what year did you go over first?
2004.
Oh, okay.
My first time over. So it had been, it had been underway, but it was still, when I first went over there, it was still very Spartan in the sense that there weren't a ton of people over there. It was still very much a special forces, special ops dominated environment. But you were starting to see an increase in the conventional forces. And frankly, Afghanistan had been used as a strategic safe haven by bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And that had been dismantled within the first 90 days. 5th Special Forces Group got in there and really pushed them out along with the Northern Alliance. But then I think we snatched defeat from the jaws of victory by basically going back to a Vietnam era construct of the war. versus like just focusing on rural villages and communities and keeping the footprint small.
Yeah.
We took it, the industrial war complex had its say, and we went full scale, you know, for what began the longest war in our nation's history. And really, frankly, for 10 years, just completely lost our way, in my assessment.
Why do you think we did that?
There's a book that I wrote as soon as I got out called Game Changers, and it's not a widely known book, but I wrote it because it's the subtitle is Going Local to Defeat Violent Extremists.
Yeah.
And you know, in that book, I chronicle a program called Village Stability Operations, where midway through the war, we kind of went back to our roots and started doing kind of a modern day Magnificent Seven of living and working in these villages. And it was very effective, but we started it too late. And I think throughout our history as a nation, particularly in modern history, we have a tendency to try to put a square peg in a round hole when we deal with these wars that are, you know, conflicts smaller in scale. You know, ever since World War II, we've dealt with these situations that are, you know, some people call it nation building, some people call it policing, and we put the Western way of war against it, and it's just not necessarily appropriate for what it is that we're trying to do in that country. I mean, we were trying to keep Al-Qaeda from reemerging, and I don't think we had a clue, I know we didn't, on how Afghanistan actually governed itself, on how people actually take action in that country. And I think what we ended up doing was we came from the top down, and we basically mobilized a fairly receptive population into being insurgents as we became occupiers.
Yeah. Did you, and I'm just asking this because I got this feeling, but I didn't know if it was accurate. Did you get the feeling that we ratcheted all that up after a couple of years being there because we were kind of in a hurry to get out of there because we had other fish to fry, so to speak, or other, you know, countries to fight, you know, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I've been very adamant about this and very, you know, loud about this, is that I don't think our politicians, our diplomats, or our senior military officers had a good understanding of how Afghanistan actually functions as a civil society. For example, that, you know, in Afghanistan, once you get beyond the one paved road that rings that country, the formal government really ends, and it's very much a bottom up society. I talk about this in my book. I call it status society, but it's very much hunter gatherer nomad kind of tribal mentality, and everything is about, you know, the group. Everything is about the group, not the individual, like we know in our democracy.
Right.
And so there's a real conflict and contrast in those two worlds. It's like two different planets.
It is.
And so what we tried to do was we tried to project from the top down this westernized style of individualism and contract society and democracy that was frankly not conducive to the kind of bottom up status honor-based society that actually defines that country. And so when you do that, what you actually do is you push people into the waiting arms of the Taliban, who had basically just were salivating for this to happen. And our leaders were just asleep at the switch. They weren't aware of it. And to be candid, I wasn't either. I mean, in the first 10 years of my life in that war, I was blinded by vengeance and retribution. And it wasn't until 2009, Mike, on the way home from another deployment, where we had killed thousands of Taliban, but there were more Taliban in the rural areas than when we had started in 2002. And it became very clear to me, like, this isn't working. Like, this is becoming about body count. This is, you know, and so yes, I do think there was. And if you go back, if you've ever read the Afghanistan papers, you should read it. It's very disconcerting. But what you see is that a lot of our general officers and flag officers and politicians, they knew that the Taliban were not fractured. They knew that this thing was nowhere near where it needed to be. Yet we were testifying to Congress that the end was near. We had them on the ropes. And there, I think, was just this inordinate pressure on military commanders, on politicians, to get the war won on their watch. And, you know, nobody was in it for the long game. Hell, it took 40 years for Afghanistan to get into the broken state that it was. The Soviets, the Civil War, the Taliban, then us. You know, their civil society was so fractured at the community level that we would go into communities where the farmers, these young men that had come in from refugee camps, were killing thumbs in tilled fields killing earthworms with their thumbs. And you're like, why would you kill earthworms in a freshly tilled field? They're good for soil.
Right.
They thought they ate the crops because their entire institutional oral history of farming had been lost in the 40-year war. So when these young men came back from the refugee camps, they thought the earthworms were the enemy to crop growth. That's how fractured civil society was, right? And so now you're going to come in there and try to wrap it all up in a year, you know, and then their army, we stood their army up from nothing. There was no army. So when we abandoned Afghanistan in 21, the army had only been around for 20 years. I mean, how many 20-year-olds do you know that are ready to step into the world and lead? Like, I mean, not a lot.
No kidding.
And so a 20-year-old army, you know, they were not ready. And so where I'm going with this, Mike, was this. Afghanistan represents a strategic safe haven for international terror groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS because it is undergoverned and they can set up shop, plan, prepare, train, and project. That is
not be interfered with.
And not be interfered with. And they do it amongst the population. That is still a reality. And what we should have done, in my estimation, was we should have taken the approach like we've done in Colombia, where we've been there for 50 years, Panama, Paraguay, is a small footprint working by, with, and through Afghanistan's special operators and certain local leaders over 75 years to help them reassert their civil society from the bottom up. And you don't need 100,000 18-year-old kids. You know, you need a much smaller number of special operators who do this for a living. And that was what I think, frankly, the politicians and the generals didn't want to hear. And so we tried to turn it into this massive westernized, you know, project of democracy building, and it failed miserably.
There's a point in Operation Pineapple Express where you talk about the Doha Accords. Can you talk about that for a second? Because not a lot of people, and I did, just so you know, after I finished your book and before you were gracious enough to accept my invitation to come on, I did send out a copy of the cover out on my social media accounts, all of them, and recommended that people read your book. And a big part of it is I feel like they should read it before this election happens. And this is not a political thing. This is just, we need to be informed as an electorate. Okay. So talk about the Doha thing for a second, because one of the things that you mentioned, and I want to make sure I understand this correctly, but one of the things that you mentioned was this entire thing was done between the US federal government and the Taliban, and the Afghan government was not involved at all.
Right. So to kind of just set it up, I appreciate you setting the question up that way. And like you, I'm very apolitical on this, Mike. I served under like a lot of officers who fought in the war in NCOs. I served under multiple administrations, some Republican, some Democrat. I will tell you, I found them all remarkably underwhelming in their ability to prosecute this war. And so, and I said this on both CNN and Fox, not one president or congressman should be thumping their chest on what happened in Afghanistan. I don't care when they serve, like not one, because of how this thing went down. It was cumulative, and everybody carries a load of responsibility, including myself. Now, all that to say, President Biden will always own this botched withdrawal, and history will never let that go, and they shouldn't, right? But the Doha Accords that led up to the withdrawal, which was under President Trump, he very much wanted out of that country. And I will tell you, Sean Ryan and I interviewed Ahmed Massoud, who is the leader of the National Resistance Front right now. Ahmed Shah Massoud's son, who led the Northern Alliance and was killed by bin Laden. And Ahmed Massoud said that the Doha Accords were the single greatest reason that Afghanistan collapsed. And the reason is because the negotiations were done with the United States and the Taliban, right? They completely left out the government of Afghanistan. And so if you stop and think about that for a second, you've got this fledgling government that is trying to assert itself. And for whatever reason, President Trump and his advisors decided that they were irrelevant and that they were incompetent and that they should not be party to the negotiations. And so when they did that, they completely relegated the government to obscurity. There was no position of relevance for them. And it emboldened and empowered the Taliban to such a degree that they started this massive campaign of a bottom-up push that we saw in August.
Yeah.
But make no mistake, the Doha Agreement ushered that in. Now, let me be also clear about something. I do believe that President Trump assigned conditions to the Doha Agreement that he would have enforced. That's just by talking to people who served under him. I do believe that, because we've seen every tenet of that agreement violated. Since then. This administration has not enforced or sought retribution for violations of the Doha Agreement. So, and I can only speculate on that. But I do know there were conditions assigned to the Doha Agreement that were not adhered to once the handoff administrations happened. So it's, a lot of blame to go around. Make no mistake, the Biden administration owns the withdrawal and the way it went down. And as far as I'm concerned, it was they have blood on their hands. They have blood on their hands, and where we're going to, unfortunately, the blood from Abbey Gate, but also you're going to see, I believe we are in for another attack on the homeland that is going to make 9/11, in the words of my friend Legend, look like a dress rehearsal.
And I 1000% agree with that. I 1000% agree with that. My problem with the Doha Accords and my problem with leaving the Afghanistan government, regardless of how feckless they are, regardless of how effective they are, okay, when you leave them out of the conversation, when you leave them out of the accord, when you leave them out of the negotiations, yes, you make them insignificant, but you basically give the Taliban credibility that the Taliban should have never had in the first place.
No, they're an illegitimate actor.
All of a sudden, all of a sudden you're picking the winners, right?
You are. Yeah, and what a sorry winner you picked. I mean, because there is no Taliban 2.0. That doesn't exist. The Taliban are the same draconian organization they have always been. They are the other side of the coin for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. There is a symbiotic relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban right now. And I'll give you one example.
Okay.
The son of Osama bin Laden, who was the leader of Al-Qaeda and killed in 2011 by U.S. Navy SEALs, the son, Hamza, is now the emir for Al-Qaeda living in Afghanistan. And he is married to the daughter of Mullah Omar, the former commander of the faithful of the Taliban. Wow. So, and the son, the oldest son of Hamza bin Laden, wait for it, is named Osama bin Laden. And his grandfather is Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar, right? So if you think that there is not a symbiotic relationship between these two organizations, you're deluded. And this is the other thing, and why I'm bringing it back to your point about every American who is going to vote should strongly consider Afghanistan, both what happened with it and what's happening now, as a central premise in how they make their voting choice. On this issue. I totally
agree.
Because there are a lot of veterans, Mike, like myself, who after 9/11, after that heinous attack, we said never again. And we dedicated our adult lives to, because the reason that it happened was there was no ground intelligence presence to deal with this emerging threat. No one listened to Ahmed Massoud's warnings as he told us it was coming. And there was no partner force to really deal with bin Laden on the ground as he grew. So we dedicated our adult lives to building an intelligence network and a capable partner force that could deal with this and prevent it from ever happening again. We did that. There was a problem with the Afghan government and the military with corruption, but the Afghan Special Operations Forces, the commandos, the Kas-Katehas, the special forces, those guys were amazing. And they fought till the last round, and we left them on the side of the road. Where I'm going is this. Because of Pineapple Express and other volunteer groups like Sacred Promise and Flanders Fields, these veterans and intelligence professionals picked up the phone when our government did not, to the very intelligence operatives and special operators who we trained for 20 years. They're still there.
Yeah.
They are inside these organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They have access and placement. They are reporting actively, and they don't trust the United States government, three letters agencies, to give this information to.
Why would they?
Exactly.
We haven't done anything to earn that trust.
No.
We turned our back on them. We
Yep.
slammed the gate shut, and a bunch of people jumped on the bottom of a C-17 and dropped from 3,000 feet in the air. Come on. I mean,
exactly.
Why would anybody trust us? We haven't earned that trust.
Right. So the most
you spent 20 years earning it. You all spent 20 years earning it, and then we shut the gate and left.
Exactly. And now you've got these same global war on terror veterans who have not hung up the phone in 3 years with these individuals who've paid for safe houses. They've paid for babies to be born. Yeah. They've paid for visas. They've resettled them here, but then they're keeping them alive over there because those individuals can't show their face.
Yeah. We're
giving $80 million in tax revenue to the Taliban every 10 days. Right. And John Sopkos from the Inspector General of Afghanistan said that somewhere around $200+ million was accidentally given to the Taliban directly. And 9/11 was a $500,000 operation. What do you think they're going to do with 200 million?
Yeah.
And so all of those veterans and intelligence operatives who are still on the phone are independently reporting that the attack against the homeland is not a matter of if, it is when. And they are in such advanced operational stages now that the operatives are all here.
Yeah.
They're all here and they are in final stages of preparation.
Yeah.
And you talk about blood on your hands, right? I mean, and all indications are when this attack comes, it is going to look much more like October 7 and much more like the Russian theater than a 9/11 World Trade Center.
Yeah.
Think about that. If that were to happen in 7 or 8 states at the same time, 12 or 13 cities at the same time, the systemic paralysis that would happen in this country and the level of bloodshed. And I don't know how else to say it. I think that this administration, but also I don't see the other party talking about it enough. I don't see the mainstream media talking about it enough. And in the GWAT generation, the veterans are screaming it to the heavens and nobody will listen. So I appreciate you asking the question. I hope that people will really dig into this and pay attention, ask hard questions, and really ask yourself, who is going to pay attention? Because at the end of the day, if we don't have national security, nothing else matters.
Well, I don't think you need, I mean, I have a real thing here where I have a challenge with people that are not an informed electorate. People that do not stay informed, okay, and don't care enough to be informed. And I get it. Watching the news and watching all these things can mess with your psyche, and they can mess with your, depression levels and all that kind of. I get all that, okay. Yeah. But I also think that it's incredibly important that you realize that, and I don't know what the number is, to be honest with you, but we left. Well, let me ask you this. You probably know way better than I do. How much in the way of our equipment did we leave there for the Taliban? Because they just had a parade with a bunch of our equipment.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. What kind of a slap in the face is that?
Yeah, I need to go back and look at the numbers. I'll get it wrong. It's in the billions.
It's in the billions.
It's in the billions. And not only that, again, this is what really bothers me, is not only we know that weapons made their way into Gaza. We know that weapons but we are also seeing evidence that the attackers in Gaza, in Israel on October 7, and the attackers in other localized locations all trained at former NATO camps in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And the operatives who are here now are trained in the same manner, and they trained in the very camps that we abandoned.
Yeah.
And it is quite likely, as John Sopkos said, the Inspector General, I cannot assure the American people that our tax dollars did not fund the next terror attack.
Well, and here's something else. And here's something that nobody's talking about, and I don't know why. One of the top arms dealers on the planet right now is the Taliban. Yep. They're selling our equipment, right? You're talking about $200 million that accidentally got to them. how much do you think they're making off of all these
On the
arms
black
sales
market.
that they're making?
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah,
You know?
it's unbelievable. And all I can say, Mike, is, we're going to, at this point, you're not stopping it. The best you can do is mitigate it. So I'm trying to get people to really seriously pay attention. Local law enforcement, first responders really need to be thinking about distributed attacks. They need to be thinking about what happens if the proliferation of drone technology that we're seeing in Ukraine, and most recently with international gangs striking a prison in South America using a drone and a warhead that's off the shelf technology. It is, imagine, if these groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS are able to use the open border to not only smuggle dudes and dudettes, but warheads, mortar rounds, you know what I mean? Like, it's not a hard thing. Imagine that kind of technology at a Taylor Swift concert, or some of these other large gatherings that we do, even the Capitol building. I mean, I don't think we're anywhere near ready for how we need to be ready. These guys have always shown themselves to be at least 5 steps ahead of us. Look at 9/11.
I agree with that.
I mean,
I agree with
they
that.
achieved a level of strategic surprise. Is not an easy thing to achieve.
Yeah.
I can tell you, like, tactical surprise is hard enough, but to surprise an entire nation, one of the most powerful nation on earth. I mean, it's been done World War II with Pearl Harbor, and really 9/11, and that's it. But they achieved it, and they proved on that day that they are usually 5 or 6 steps ahead of us. Now, during that time, at least there was some focus on them. Right now, the 3-letter agencies and this administration are not only not focusing on them, they are paying them to actually target ISIS, as if they are going to do that responsibly. And the level of just that, how incredulous that is to me, that just 20 some years after 9/11, that we as an institutional power could allow that to happen, and that our citizenry could be that asleep at the switch as a veteran of that war, is staggering to me.
Mind-boggling. It's absolutely.
Mind-boggling. Yeah.
And I think you used the word gobsmacked one time. Yeah. It's like crazy, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna ask you one more thing about Afghanistan, then we need to move forward. So the way that we left Afghanistan.
Yeah.
How many terrorists do you think we made that day?
Oh, well, think about it this way. There were roughly 30,000 commandos, special forces. That's not counting interpreters, Koskateha. So like surgical strike, really highly trained, highly vetted Afghan special operators who were left behind, right?
Yeah.
So those individuals, have been, and we left all of the biometrics databases and the portable kits that you would use to test the biometrics. And we insisted that all of these individuals were in the biometric system, right? So when we left the country, we handed the Taliban the ability to biometrically identify every special operator in the inventory. Now, I'm not the brightest star in the sky, but we know this is also happening. If you kidnap said commando's family and you start cutting their fingers off, or sending pictures of their child beheaded and there's other 2 waiting, and you say, you have a very simple choice. You can join our brigade of commandos in the Taliban. ISIS does the same thing, or we're going to kill your family. Or you can go and fight on the front in Ukraine with Russia, or we're going to kill your family. Or if you're hiding out in Iran, the Quds forces can say, you're going to do operations for us in Gaza, or we're going to kill your family, who, by the way, we have right now in our custody. And so this is happening at scale, right?
They're going door to door. It's like, I mean,
And I actually have a scene in my play that is I call it a coda. It's a scene that I wrote that's only been in a few of the shows, but at the end of the play, my character's son, Caden, ends up joining special forces, and the lights go out at the end of the play. And then you hear this news flash of an attack on the.
We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out calendly.com/Rio760.